for me, my biggest decision as a Year 10 student was when I accidentally signed up for work experience with a local heavy vehicle diesel mechanic workshop. Now, I imagine you're wondering, because I'm often still wondering, how do you accidentally sign up for work experience? I sat through a 20-minute presentation by this local employer, Cummins, and they talked about what it was they did in their business and what their apprenticeship program was like. Now, I sat through this and put my hand up to sign up for work experience, yet I still hadn't really figured out what it was I was actually signing up for. I thought maybe I could be cool like Megan Fox in the first Transformers movie and have a go at working on cars. But as you can see, as a 14-year-old, I had a bit of a way to go still. So when I found out that I was going to be working on trucks, I was intimidated. I thought I was too small to work on trucks. I have no mechanics in my family. I'd never had an interest in cars or mechanical applications before, and it was really something I'd signed up for on a fluke. It was even an accident that I'd even attended that presentation by Cummins. But fortunately, my parents convinced me not to waste a good opportunity, and I went to my week of work experience. Now, I wore overalls, and this was the smallest pair of overalls they could find me, and they were 3 times my size. I went in and I didn't even know the difference between a flathead screwdriver and a Phillips screwdriver. So I went into this work experience with no interest at being a mechanic. Yet I went and I loved my week of work experience. So my biggest decision, which was ultimately an accident, led me to signing up to vet in my Year 11 studies. But for anyone else's reference, in case you accidentally sign up for work experience at a local mechanic workshop as well, this is the difference between a Phillips and a flathead screwdriver. A Phillips screwdriver is the one with a star on the end. So now if you do go and work on cars or trucks, you're one step ahead of where I was. So since I signed up for a vet subject alongside my VCE subjects as a high school student in Year 11, what this meant was I did 1 day per week at my school's trade training centre studying the automotive studies. But the rest of the people in my class were VCAL students, and that meant that they had time within their school system that they were able to go and do work experience throughout their school weeks as part of their curriculum. For me, since I was also studying VCE and couldn't actually take time away from my other subjects, I wasn't able to do any more work experience. So what I ended up doing was around my part-time work on the weekend and around school, I went and did work experience throughout my school holidays. Throughout my time in high school, I did 2 weeks of work experience at the Volkswagen workshop, which is just off Old Geelong Road. I also did a week of work experience with BMW at their branch in Geelong. And I spent another week or so I ended up spending 2 weeks total with Cummins throughout my time doing work experience in high school. I was trying to decide whether I preferred working on cars or trucks. But I didn't actually make my decision to become a heavy vehicle diesel mechanic until the start of Year 12. So at the start of Year 12, there was a lot more conversation about what universities we're applying to, especially as the majority of people in the classes were VCE students. Yet, when I actually listened to myself and the conversations I'd been having with my parents for the last few weeks, I realized that I didn't want to go to university. I wanted to start an apprenticeship. I'd been telling my parents about what the work hours were at Cummins, about the toolbox they were going to supply me, and I even was telling my mum that she didn't have to wash my work overalls because work was going to do that for me. And when I finally heard myself saying this, that was when I made my decision. So, because of that decision, I didn't apply to any universities at the start of Year 12, but I continued my studies and still planned on doing my Year 12 exams. When the job applications opened for Cummins apprenticeships, I put my resume in, and they asked for me to come in and do work experience again, even though I'd been twice in the previous 2 years. I barely had time around doing practice exams for my Year 12 studies and just all my other studies that I was doing as part of trying to see how well I perform in VCE. But I managed to fit 3 days in during my school holidays. At the end of that 3 days, I was pulled into the boss's office and he offered me the job. He hadn't even reviewed any other applications yet. So I went into my Year 12 exams with a job already lined up, all the paperwork signed, and I was just able to do my exams and knew that at the end of my year 12, I'd have a job that I could start straight away. During my exams, I was able to perform without the pressure of worrying what comes next. I already had an answer. I wasn't waiting for a university to accept me. And I managed to get the second highest ATAR at my school with a 95. This came as a surprise to many of my friends and teachers. I wasn't well known for being a high achiever as a student, even though I performed well in all my subjects throughout high school. So I ended up being a little bit of a dark horse in terms of my ATAR results. And then, of course, I hadn't applied for any universities and I'd picked an apprenticeship, which confused a lot of people. And I've been a mechanic ever since. So, what does being a diesel mechanic actually look like? It's a very diverse field. So I was lucky with my employer. They were a diesel engine company. So that meant that I wasn't limited to trucks, even though it was the majority of my work. Diesel engines are in a lot of different applications. They're running power generation units, which are like backup power if electricity fails in places like hospitals or any high importance kind of facilities like that. They're also in boats. They're in our V-line trains here in Victoria. They're in farming equipment, and sometimes they're just standalone engines that might run some accessory somewhere. So throughout the course of my apprenticeship, these are some pictures I've accumulated. And so the field and the work I do could be anywhere from welding, as I am in the bottom left picture, to just swapping filters on an engine, to even pulling an engine apart until it was nothing more than a metal block with bolt holes everywhere. So that allowed me to see a very diverse field and a lot of different things as part of being a diesel mechanic. So my work was Monday to Friday, 8 hours a day. And I would be taught about how to be a diesel mechanic by the mechanics around me, whether they were fully qualified or just higher level apprentices. I was being taught on the job while I was getting paid. And then it's about 6 weeks every year, I'd get sent into trade school where I got to meet with other apprentices from different workshops, and we got taught the theory of what it was we were doing in our day-to-day work. For myself, as someone who performed well academically, yet still wanted a hands-on job, I got the best of both worlds as a diesel mechanic. I got to be on my feet all day, I didn't have to sit behind a computer, and I didn't have to sit in lecture halls. I got to be physically active with my job. And I still got the mental stimulation through the nature of the work. Because to be a good mechanic, you have to understand how things work. And then if something goes wrong, and sometimes it's not a simple job of pull that component off and put a new one on, often you have to spend a few hours trying to diagnose what's actually gone wrong. And in those situations, I had the opportunity to really use my brain and feel mentally stimulated as well. So with the best of both worlds, being both physically and mentally active, it made me really excited and engaged to be a mechanic. So I managed to qualify 8 months early. So it's normally a 4-year apprenticeship. And I qualified 8 months early because of how I performed. And even then, I still thought I was too small for trucks. But after qualifying, I took up a new job. And I'm now a FIFO worker out of a coal mine in Queensland. Now, what FIFO means is fly in, fly out. So I will work for 7 days in a row where my employer will fly me from Brisbane Airport to the area where I'll be working. They pay for my accommodation, they pay for my food, and they provide a bus to get me from the campground accommodation to the work site where I get to carry out my role as a diesel mechanic. And then at the end of my 7-day work week, they're 12.5-hour days, so they are longer. But at the end of my 7 days, they'll fly me back home, and then I get 7 days off to do whatever I want with my time. So now that I'm in this new job role, and I thought I was too small for trucks, I am definitely too small for mining. So, as I've mentioned, this job isn't without its challenges. As I've proven, I'm quite small, and I haven't grown since like year 5. So I'm definitely on the smaller end of the spectrum, even as a 22-year-old. And it is quite a physical job. So since there's so many heavy components in being a diesel mechanic, there's a lot of technology available to help make the job accessible. Because Even sometimes the people who are 3 times my size can't lift a component because it just weighs too much and the components are too big. So that means we're using overhead cranes or forklifts to help lift heavy components. The culture is also a lot more aware of the physical risks from lifting heavy components, because there used to be a culture of, if you were a mechanic, it was unlikely you were a mechanic past the age of 40 because you'd probably damage your back and be stuck in an office. So knowing that that was a health risk, there's a lot more support in the culture for asking for help, for taking the time to get the right tooling to lift the components. And it makes it more accessible that it's not about being the biggest, strongest person in the workshop anymore. So the industry is a lot more aware of the hazards and a lot more supportive. And then being small can also be an advantage. So there's many times where we might be replacing a component that's really small, but it's in the center of the equipment. And for anyone else, they might have to spend 2 or 3 hours pulling panels off just to reach the part that's going to take them 5 minutes. Whereas me, being the smallest person on the team, I managed to contort my body into these spaces and replace the component. What this means is I've saved my team 3 or 4 hours worth of ultimately meaningless work. So even though I'm small, it doesn't actually stop me from doing my job. There are things that I have to learn to do differently though, and there are times I'm an advantage. Learning to do the job differently looks like using longer bars to loosen a bolt or tighten a bolt that someone else might not need a tool that long for, because that leverage of using a longer tool gives me more strength without me actually having to be stronger. Another thing I had to learn to do was use my body weight. So instead of just relying on the strength of my arms, which might be half the size of someone else's, I've had to learn how to use my entire body weight to help me move something, whether it's undoing a bolt or tightening a bolt. And even there's been times when I've used my leg rather than my arms to undo something, because my leg muscle is naturally bigger than my arm muscle. And it's in a way that I've had to learn to use my body to my advantage. So doing the job differently hasn't been a disadvantage to me. And this is a lesson that applies to many industries. Just because you do the job differently, whether it's because of your physical abilities, your knowledge, or your experience, doesn't mean you're less valuable. There's always something that you're going to be able to bring to any workforce. I hope you guys have taken something away from that.